land might be the only thing in the world that we can't make more of. And as a result, stewardship of the land is something that's been happening since the beginning of time. So, who better to steward the land here in Canada than those who work on the land every day as part of their farming and ranching activities? So, to talk more about land stewardship in Alberta, we're bringing in Justin Thompson, the Executive Director of Southern Alberta Land Trust, or SALTS, as it's known. Justin, welcome to Bridge City News.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, absolutely. So, Justin, for those who may not have heard of SALTS here in Alberta, can you maybe give us a brief overview of how your organization cares for the rural and wild lands of Alberta?
Sure. So SALTS is a land trust organization, and we're a bit unique because, as you mentioned, our organization was started by ranchers in southern Alberta, and our board of directors is still primarily made up of folks who ranch on a full-time basis. And so our focus is really to work with landowners to conserve those private lands in southern Alberta that are of high ecological value. So wildlife habitat, important watershed areas. And so we do that through a tool called a conservation easement, which has been used now for, I guess, about 25 years in Alberta. And it essentially, in partnership with the landowner, if the landowner wants to see their land conserved, the easement basically puts a set of restrictions on the land that limit certain types of development. So, subdivision, new roads, cultivation, for example, of native grasslands, but really continues to support and encourage land uses like ranching that keep the land intact and support those values like wildlife habitat, like healthy watersheds, and also help to essentially keep the land in agriculture.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you support them, but maybe can you talk about the relationship between SALTS and the farmers and ranchers in Alberta?
Absolutely, yeah. So when we enter into a conservation easement and the landowner decides they want to see their land protected, it's a long-term relationship. The land is protected in perpetuity, but we also work with the landowners. Our landowners typically are already very good stewards, so they're already really interested in maintaining things like range health, riparian health. But we also try to bring extra value to the landowner where we can bring dollars for off-stream watering, fencing projects that help manage the grassland and the habitat. And so we're working with them on an ongoing basis. A lot of these landowners already know how to steward the land really well, but of course the economics of ranching is challenging. And so we try and bring some support to the table to help them do the absolutely best job of stewarding those lands. The big thing we do, though, is the front end, where these important properties that could be converted to a non-agricultural use, like subdivision and development, roads, whatever it might be, the big step is to keep those lands from becoming more fragmented. So in the case, for example, for Lethbridge specifically, SALTS has done conservation projects with landowners covering about 35,000 acres in the Old Man watershed, which is about, I think, about 140 square kilometers of land, and that's all upstream of Lethbridge. And a lot of those projects are along rivers like the Old Man or the Crow's Nest, which means those lands are going to keep helping to provide services like clean water, flood mitigation, because when we convert these landscapes to things like houses and roads, of course, the water comes off more quickly, it comes off dirtier. And so we're really trying to maintain things like water quality upstream.
Yeah. Okay. So you gave me some numbers there with some areas around the Old Man watershed and near Lethbridge. Maybe can you give us an idea of the amount of land that's being conserved with SALTS overall?
Yeah, so actually, because so much of SALT's work is from sort of west of Calgary down to Waterton Lakes National Park, most of our conservation easements are in the Old Man watershed. So again, about 35,000 acres of the land that we've protected is in the Old Man watershed. We've done probably another 10,000 acres outside. But really, that's why I'm excited to talk to you, is that so much of our work really is protecting lands that are of really high value for water and also recreation. If you like fishing, if you like hunting, we're protecting lands that are maintaining those resources, west of Lethbridge. If you start to look at what other land trusts, so there's SALTS, there's organizations like Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, there's other regional land trusts. There's been hundreds of thousands of acres conserved in the Old Man watershed, upstream of Lethbridge. And that is going to be really valuable in the long term to maintaining things like water quality and quantity downstream. for the irrigation districts too, right? If we can keep those lands intact, so they're providing better water flow throughout seasons and those sorts of things. So a lot of work being done. And I think, we don't do a lot of communications to folks in cities, but a lot of the work that we're doing is really having a direct benefit for cities, even though we're working in these rural areas.
Interesting. Okay, so how do you see the mission of salts that impacts Albertans and I suppose visitors even to the province as well?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, even though we're really focused on, how do you maintain healthy grasslands and riparian areas and watersheds, if you start to think of what that means, for example, we've protected a bunch of land along the Cowboy Trail, which means, that's one of the most beautiful highways in my mind anywhere in the world. And it's a real tourism draw. People go down that highway and they're like, isn't this amazing? This big open country, open spaces, no development. So by keeping that as open space, there's tourism value there. Land trusts like salts have protected a huge amount of, for example, winter range for deer and elk and moose. So if you're interested as a hunter, we're helping to protect that resource. We've conserved kilometers of land on either sides of rivers, like the Castle, the Old Man, and the Crow's Nest. So if you like fishing, it's preserving those resources. So there's recreation, there's tourism, there's aesthetic resources that are all being conserved on private land that are benefiting Albertans really broadly.
Now, there's an education component to salt. So maybe what can you tell us about it?
Yeah, I think our biggest effort on the education side is helping people to understand the value of these private lands in Alberta. I think a lot of people think, well, we have our parks, right? We've got our parks in the mountains, and so we've got it all done. But there's a lot of private land outside of parks that we rely on for things like freshwater and wildlife. And so that's our biggest push from an education standpoint, especially in talking to people that live in urban centers, to just help them understand just how valuable these landscapes are. And the other thing we like to help people understand is that, ranching and grazing on our grasslands and foothills is probably the most compatible land use. Those landscapes evolved with grazing by bison, and they actually require grazing in order to maintain biodiversity and the health of the soil. And so a lot of people, I think, have concerns, but don't realize that, in fact, having ranching on those landscapes is probably the most compatible land use if you want to maintain things like water quality and wildlife habitat. So that's another big education piece here, is that, if we remove grazing from that landscape in the foothills and the grasslands, it would actually have a negative effect on a lot of these things that we value.
Wow. So in your mind, Justin, it's important for landowners to participate in the mission of SALT, obviously. Are there risks, though, or downside? Is there a downside for landowners who participate with the land trust?
We do not get involved in the day-to-day management of the land. So really, we're very hands-off. The landowner can continue to manage the land. The land can be transferred to their family. It can be sold. We have no say in that. It's if the landowner's values align with our values, then it's a really good fit. And another big factor here is that salts, when we do these conservation easements, can bring some really important financial incentives to the landowner, because the landowner is giving up some development rights when they do these easements. Okay. And so in return, we can compensate them for that. And we can do that often through a combination of a charitable receipt and some cash payment. And those charitable receipts can often be really helpful to ranchers and landowners who are dealing with the transfer of their land, for example, the next generation. So we can facilitate often the transfer of land between generations and help to avoid big capital gains tax that might otherwise mean they'd have to sell parts of the ranch during that transfer. So, there's the conservation value if the landowners are aligned, and so if there's alignment there, no downsides. We're not involved in the management, and there's also this financial opportunity that can really help families if they're trying to make sure they can continue to ranch.
Interesting. Okay, so Justin, looking ahead a couple of decades, how big of a role does we were talking about Southern Alberta, Lethbridge, how big of a role does the Highway 2 corridor between Lethbridge and Calgary play in the future targets for land stewardship?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the Highway 2 corridor, has a really interesting mix. Certainly along the east side of the corridor, there's a lot of cultivated land, but there's also some pockets of really important grassland habitat. But west of Highway 2, all along the Porcupine Hills, that is actually to the west of Highway 2, on the east side of the Porcupine Hills, that is one of the biggest remaining blocks of grassland in southern Alberta. It's one of those places that has not been converted to other land uses. And so that's a really important area for us to try and see, both from a wildlife standpoint, but also from a watershed, right? Because so many of our creeks and rivers flow off those foothills. And so keeping those foothills intact is really key. And so really we're trying to make sure, land conservation will never protect all the land, and we can't, and we don't intend to, but we're really trying to focus in on those areas of the province that have the highest ecological value, but also going to benefit Albertans long term down the road in terms of protecting our water and our wildlife resources and our tourism resources. So the Highway 2 corridor is really key. Like I said, west of Highway 2, there's some really, really important land. And then there's also some areas just east of Highway 2, there's pockets of grasslands that are really valuable habitat, especially along our rivers. If we can keep some of that land next to our rivers in sort of a more natural state, it's important. There's so much wildlife, of course, that we know that congregates on rivers. It helps the water quality in the river if there's natural landscapes on either side. There are wildlife corridors up and down rivers, so it's a very important area.
Are there any number of bears or other predatory animals? Are they increasing to your knowledge?
Yeah, I mean that's a really big, complex question. I mean, we have for a number of years we've seen a lot more, I think, predators on private lands. We've got a lot of black bears and grizzly bears and cougars in the foothills of Alberta, and they're also moving along those corridors, the river corridors. And so that's been something that ranchers are having to manage. I think there's been more and more effective tools on how we coexist with those predators. And there's been a lot of good work done on how we coexist with those predators because, in the past we would just get rid of them. But I think now we're moving towards a new relationship with a lot of those predators. And I think, for the most part, the ranching industry is trying to find a balance to coexist.
Oh, that's fantastic. And of course, here in the southwest corner of Alberta, something also that you see a lot is logging, oil, gas, and mining operations in the area. So do you see an increasing relationship between stewarding the land and resource use?
It's a good question. I mean, more of the proposals for logging and mining are happening on public lands. And of course, with salts, we're just working on private lands. Conservation easements, if there's existing oil and gas or there's mineral rights holders, conservation easements don't, stop the mineral rights holder necessarily. We try and work with the landowner. And if there's proposals for oil and gas, for example, we try and work with the landowner and the proponent to really minimize the impact to the property from an ecological standpoint. It's not a big part of what we're seeing. We're not seeing a lot of new mineral development like oil and gas, and certainly not forestry or mining on our properties that we work with landowners. It's not a huge factor. I think it is interesting though to talk about the interplay between the private land and the crown land next door, because we have these proposals sometimes on crown land, but then of course what happens to water and wildlife on crown land will affect the private land right downstream or right next door. And so where we're working to conserve private land up and down the foothills, we do want to make sure that's what's happening next door on the public land is making sure that both are complementing each other. So they're related, but we're not seeing that doesn't affect us directly.
Justin, it looks like we're about out of time, but thanks so much for joining us today. I appreciate having you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Justin Thompson is the Executive Director of the Southern Alberta Land Trust.